Tom Carey. That's Don Schmidt.
Afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
We are here this afternoon. We are gathered together to talk about false flags in our search for Roswell's Holy Grail.
My dinner.
And what that means is that over the years, the quarter century that we've been investigating this, not everybody was truthful to us. Also, we've had numerous attempts to provide us with physical evidence, which never worked out, and we are still without a true piece of physical evidence to the Roswell incident. So that's what our presentation is today. We're going to start out with some of the people that have not always told us the truth, and then go to the actual attempts at physical evidence that we were able to at least find out that it wasn't true, but some of the things that came our way. So I guess we should, can you turn out the light down? It's the farthest one, when that switch there is the far one. Okay, so of course I can't see my keyboard here. Oh, jeez. Let me see here. Okay. Did you do that?
I think you did.
Okay. The first, where'd he go?
He's trying to think like that.
The first,
I got lost.
the first false flag was the weather balloon story. That if you know the Roswell case, they first claimed it was a flying saucer that crashed. Then within hours, they changed it to a weather balloon. And kneeling, you can see General Roger Ramey, and sitting Colonel Thomas Jefferson DuBose. And it was actually DuBose that told us that this concocted weather balloon story was a false flag. So, Don, you have something to add to that.
When we had, I don't usually use this, but when we had the good fortune of actually meeting with General DuBose down in Orlando, and obviously one of the questions we asked, did the balloon come from Fort Worth, from Carswell? Because obviously that's where they were displaying it. And he would go, no, I don't know where we got it. Well, if I were to tell you that the weather balloon displayed in General Ramey's office, which became the official explanation for the next 30 years, came here from Roswell. In fact, Tom, can you go back to it?
I'm going to get the mouse.
Okay. If you were to look directly beneath the balloon wreckage, you would see a sheet of brown wrapping paper. And it was Sergeant Robert Porter of the 715th Bomb Squadron who described to us that they loaded up packages into the waiting B-29, which was called Dave's Dream. 3 of them were about the size of a shoebox, and we'll point out you actually see one of those back by a heat register, and the other was triangular in shape, about 3.5 feet in diameter. Well, that was the wreckage from the balloon. That's what was loaded up into the back of the B-29 that Major Marcel was on. The original destination was Wright Field. And once they were airborne, they diverted to Texas and went to Carswell. And that's where General Ramey, they were waiting to do the old switcheroo. And DuBose would sign an affidavit before he died that they were the ones who switched it. So his very chief of staff admitted that they were the ones that when they had Major Marcel out of the room, and you see the brown wrapping paper, you see the triangular portion of the kite, And where were those kites being launched twice a day? Again, here in Roswell. In fact, in the Roswell yearbook, there's a photograph of these balloons suspended from the rafters in one of the buildings. And then one of our witnesses, Sergeant Earl Fulford, they used to assemble them. Well, the balloons were used in conjunction with the bomb drop exercises they were doing, as far as training for the atomic bomb. They weren't using actual bomb casings, they were using sand barrels at equivalent weight. But time and time again, when we've been on the outskirts surrounding Roswell, we stumble upon a long stretch of long buried asphalt. Well, these were the emergency runways for the B-29s as they were doing this. But the point being, nobody knew these balloons better than the person out here at Roswell. And the irony that then would become the explanation for the balloons that they themselves were working with every day while they were stationed here.
Can you see those all right? Can you see that all right, or should we darken the room?
Darken the room, yeah.
Your flashlight has a light on, and your phone has a flashlight on.
So here we have one of the weather balloons that they said the men of the 509 couldn't identify, were misidentified as a intergalactic spaceship. And here we have the headline that's killed the story for the next 31 years. The General Ramey empties Roswell saucer, and the press was only too happy to put this one to bed, and it remained asleep for the next 31 years. They brought in, just to put the exclamation point on it, they brought in the base weatherman, Irving Newton. And General Ramey says, Irving, or I don't know if he's a corporal or what, but he says, get over here, I want you to identify a weather balloon. So that was his orders. So he goes over and identifies it as a weather balloon, like he was told.
First lieutenant.
What's right?
First lieutenant in his office.
Was your first lieutenant? Doesn't look like he's wearing any socks there, so.
Well, actually, he was off duty at the time, and the general pretty much told him, get your butt over here immediately, and caught him by surprise.
And he did tell him to identify a weather balloon, and that was part of the story. Here he is years later, in retirement, still telling the same story. It was a weather balloon. Well, that's all he knew.
That's all he knew.
That's all he knew. He was following orders. Yes, General, this is a weather balloon. And when he was interviewed years later, well, it was what I saw was a weather balloon. Well,
How many here, certainly, as far as those who have had military service, just imagine this scenario. What actually happened was the two pictures of the weather balloon, with as far as the substitute balloon with Major Jesse Marcel, were taken first before any of the press were allowed in the room. And they were taken by the public information officer, Major Charles Cashin. When we found him in Ohio, his immediate rule, who told you about me, how'd you find me, I have nothing to say about it. Well, if you took pictures of a weather balloon, why won't you talk about it? Well, he refused. But nonetheless, Ramey would order Marcel to leave the office, not to say a word to any of the reporters. And they kept him overnight. He wouldn't fly back to Roswell till late the next afternoon. Then he allowed only one reporter by the name of James Bond Johnson from the Fort Worth Star Telegram to take the pictures. Two of just Ramey, and then four of just Ramey, and then two of Ramey and his chief of staff, DeBose. The shot with Newton was taken again later, based on the lighting, the shadows. You can tell as far as the lighting coming in through the window. But Newton would claim to the day he died that Marcel was still in the general's office, and he was arguing with him that it was still a flying saucer. That the weather balloon was still pieces of an actual flying saucer. So you see again when you become a dupe for the military, slash the government in regards to this. You stick to your story. And that's how he inserted himself in the last few years of his life, as being the end-all and the final solution to what actually happened back in 1947. And as Tom said, the only thing he saw was the weather balloon, and he did not encounter Major Marcel, not in the slightest.
One of the favorite Air Force witnesses here was a liar from start to finish. He even lied to the Air Force. And this is Captain Sheridan Cabot, the chief counterintelligence officer at the base in 1947. Don and Kevin Randall interviewed Sheridan in person
Numerous times.
several times. And he was one of those fellas that he went out to the site with the Major Marcel, saw everything, but he claimed that it was a weather device, a weather balloon, that they just were able to pack up in one trip and put it in the back of his Jeep carryall and drive it back to base. But when first interviewed, I think he denied that he was in the Air Force.
They denied he was at Roswell.
Then he denied he was at Roswell. He denied. You see, he's got a little smirk on his face there.
And in fact, this was the first meeting we had with them in their winter home in Sierra Vista, Arizona. And after a full afternoon of just saying, I wasn't there. So we walked out to the car, he followed us, and then he asked us, he said, boys, I just need to know, should you find anything that would threaten national security, you will keep it to yourselves, won't you? And we looked at one another, well, he was a lieutenant colonel at the time, well, of course, colonel, yes, by all means. And we got in the car, and we looked at one another and went, he knows. And so there would be subsequent meetings up in his regular home in Sequim, Washington. We would talk to him over the phone. And on one occasion, I was talking to his wife, Mary. And she's telling me this story about, see, the Marcels and the Cabots would get together and play bridge every week. And after Marcel was allowed to come back from Fort Worth, and the following week, they resumed their card game. But this particular night, the men were in the kitchen and the women remained in the front room. And what were the men doing in the kitchen? They were heating up a piece of the memory material on the stove, trying to get it to have, some effect. And just as I'm asking Mary what became of it, I hear someone grumbling in the background, and I'm thinking, oh, it's Kev, as they call him, Kev. Now she's in trouble. And he grabs the phone and he goes, Don, did you boys ever think of breaking up that old Marcel patio? Because outside the kitchen was a newly poured concrete slab. In fact, we were hoping that it was poured after, but it had just been poured according to, as far as the deed and the permit that was taken out with the city of Roswell, just 3 weeks before. But the sod was still open around the sides. It hadn't been filled in. So after he would die, and Tom was with me at that time, we actually went up to Sequim and we met with her to hear the rest of the story, so to speak. And that's when she told us that her husband reminded Marcel that he better get rid of it, that it was classified top secret. And she described that they walked out onto the new patio, and when they came back, it was gone. So we can only imagine that maybe something was tucked underneath the concrete. Well, then you're probably, well, why did you guys go back and look? Because they built a family room over the concrete in years since. And we've even had the Prince of Liechtenstein who offered to demolish the house just so we could check and then rebuild it. And every owner since is just saying, no publicity, we don't want to get involved, you're not touching anything. So what we're looking forward to is concrete penetrating radar, which was developed by the Army. And we're going to take a look. So it's on our bucket list.
This is a shot of Don and myself. We traveled to Portland, Oregon, to about 20 years ago, it seems. My hair wasn't white yet, so that means it was about 20 years ago.
You have alien eyes.
And this is the daughter of the rancher Mac Brazel. This is Bessie Brazel. And for years, she told the story of being out there with her father Mac, and it was something like the material was something like we would call mylar today, not a spaceshipy type of thing, but something like rubberized mylar or mylarized rubber, one of those two things. And for years, the Air Force loved her because she was saying it was something other than a spaceship. Well, Don then picks up the story. Well, when we left this meeting, she said it was a high altitude type weather balloon. So that's the Project Mogul story. But when we're getting up to leave, she slammed her fist down on the table. I jumped a foot. And she said, whatever I said, my father told the truth. And you can take whatever he said to the bank. So whatever he said was the truth. And that was the end of our meeting then. But Don picked it up a little later on with her.
Well, even before though, because the first time I talked with her on the phone and she was giving me, the balloon story. But mainly she was describing being there at the ranch at the time of the incident. And I kind of tripped her up when she was describing that, well, I was a 14-year-old teenager at the time, and I said, well, you must have already been interested in boys, because you're talking about a ranch at that time that didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, didn't have a telephone, didn't have a radio or television, and didn't have any boys. And yet they had a nice home in Tularosa, north of Alamogordo. And so she would go, yes, I was especially interested in boys. And then I asked her, so what were you doing at the ranch that summer? And she couldn't give me a reason, because there wouldn't have been any reason for her to be there. So I called up her older brother, Bill. And I said, your sister is now claiming she was there with your dad when this happened. And he shouted into the phone, what? She was not even there that summer. In fact, she was never there. So, as Tom said, that's why she would become one of the star witnesses of the Air Force. But then, as he also described, and then after we met with her, and then it was her second husband. Her first husband had died before that. Her second husband, Robert, right after we left, he started pressing her at the dinner table. Bess, how do you know you were there? In fact, you know your dad picked up a lot of weather balloons on that ranch. How do you know it wasn't just some other incident? And we would talk again a few weeks later, and she went, Don, I think you got it right. I was not there with Dad when this happened. I think it was a separate incident altogether. So please. And then we would talk to a nephew, and he said too that she confessed and apologized to the family. In fact, her brother, she actually came down from Portland, down to Capitan, New Mexico, and apologized to him as well. That she had been misrepresenting the family all those years, and she realized that she had confused some other event with what her father got in all this trouble over. And it had nothing to do with the Roswell incident of 1947.
Here is the former Secretary of the Air Force under President Bill Clinton, Sheila Widnall. And in 1993, at the behest of Congressman Stephen Schiff from New Mexico, he tasked the General Accounting Office, now known as the General Accountability Office of Congress, to investigate not whether Roswell really happened, but whether all of the documents and the media, transmissions and things like that, whether all of those were handled and classified correctly. And what he found was that they had been destroyed by an unknown authority, unknown date. Well, let me tell you, I was in the Air Force for 4 years. You can't even go to the bathroom without authority. Everything is under some regulation or authority, but this was unknown authority, unknown date of destruction. But Sheila Windall, she said, well, while the Congress is doing an investigation here, let's do another Air Force investigation. And she interviewed Sheridan Cabot, as Don described. He was her star witness. But she assigned Colonel Richard Weaver, and his investigator, I guess, was McAndrew. A guy named McAndrew. James McAndrew. And they came a year later. This would be, it's either, I can't see from here, it was either 1993 or 1994. The Air Force report, and that's where they came out with this. This was the executive summary, and the real heavy-duty report came out a year later. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong slide. Here it is. Here's the report. Report of Air Force research regarding the Roswell incident, July 1994. That was the executive summary. And the next year they came out with the biggie, the report on the Roswell report, Fact and Fiction in the New Mexico Desert, written by Richard Weaver. And it was nothing more than everything you wanted to know, but we're afraid to ask about Project Mogul. Okay. That's what it was. And here's a picture of Project Mogul. It was a bunch of those weather balloons you saw in the previous picture strung together, lifting a acoustic sensor into the stratosphere to remain up there so that they could listen in on an expected detonation of a Soviet atomic device. And that's what that was all about. And that's their position today. That is their position today as far as the wreckage is concerned. And the New York Times, who normally doesn't believe anything our military says without, double checking, they put this hook, line, and sinker, this Project Mogul hook, line, and sinker, wreckage of a spaceship of this Earth and U.S. End of story. And, the New York Times is still influential. A lot of other media take their cue from the New York Times. So, do you have anything, Don, about?
Yes, and getting back to the Secretary of the Air Force, Sheila Windall, at one point she also signed a directive as the Secretary of the Air Force to all former Air Force personnel, absolving them of all their security oaths regarding the Roswell incident in 1947. Now, can anybody figure out what's wrong with the Air Force being absolved of all security oaths regarding an incident in July of 1947? There was no Air Force in July of 1947. This was an Army incident. How does the Air Force absolve the Army of security oaths? They don't, they can't. Red herring, and not a member of the press ever picked up on it. We did. In fact, then as we would use that very statement and show it to our witnesses, how often, our reluctant witnesses, they would say, sorry, doesn't apply to us. I was Army. So again, it's just a case of where the media not knowing their own history and not doing their homework and just accepting. You heard me.
They wanted to accept it.
They want to accept it. And as I mentioned yesterday morning, the talk before Tom got here, and when the New York Times first came out with this, and we sent the facts and we offered, we could provide you with a single witness to the bodies, would you reconsider your present position on Roswell? And they said, if you can present us with a single witness to Roswell, not only will we retract this particular mobile balloon explanation, but also the original balloon explanation from 1947. Well, we didn't send them one. We sent them 8. And needless to say, they did not, correspond, or they did not react in any, as far as positive manner, to our carrying out our side of the deal.
That was just to make you go away.
That was to make us go away.
What about the bodies? That Project Mogul report was about the physical wreckage. Well, people back in 47 had reported these strange little beings, about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, large oversized head, frail body, little slit for a mouth, slanted eyes to some degree, no nose, just 2 little holes in the front of the face, and no ears, just 2 little holes on the side of the head. Well, what about those people? Well, the previous report didn't talk about that. Well, they came up with this theory that what these people back in 1947 were doing, as they grew older, they all suffered from something that only Roswell witnesses suffer from, something called time compression. They were really reporting something about that they had seen out in the desert 10 years later, these crash test dummies, the dummies in the middle, that they used for these high altitude parachute drops in anticipation of these advanced aircraft that might run into trouble, let's say at 100,000 feet, or something to do with the space program. These are typical dime store mannequins that they suited up in flight suits and they dropped them from like 100,000 feet, and that was what they said was that these people back at 47 were now reporting. But if you look at that, that thing is at least 6 feet tall. It doesn't have an oversized head. And as the fellow on the right, I forget his name.
Madsen?
Wayne Madsen? Yes. He said, when those things hit the ground, they just fly apart. Everything, the arms, legs, and everything just flies apart. Well, that's not what the people in 47 were reporting. But that's the Air Force position today. Project Mogul and these dummies from the sky, as we call them. So, Don, you have, I pretty much cover it there, or what I leave out? Okay. So that's the Air Force position today. You call them up, oh yes, it's the time compressed dummies from the sky.
Well, what we did mention was that this is part of one of the, there were 2 projects called, one was High Dive and the other Excelsior. And they would not originate, and the reason I was talking about time compression is that the projects didn't originate until 5 years after Roswell. And even when we contacted the Pentagon and said, well, we need you to be aware of the fact that all of our witnesses to the bodies at Roswell were no longer in New Mexico in 1952. So how can you explain that they then saw the crash dummies at that particular time? Again, every time we would pose the hard questions to the powers that be, they crawled back into their holes, once again, hoping that as they would stall for time, the people would buy it, the press would buy it. And this particular night, I'll never forget, after the press conference, well, first of all, there was a Pentagon spokesperson who was asked by a reporter. And after the room of press were laughing about this, because is there anyone even sitting in the back that has a problem seeing that that's just a wooden dummy? Well, the Pentagon spokesperson was asked, well, what if the people don't accept this explanation? To which he responded, well, then I guess we'll be back in another few years offering another explanation. So in other words, we're just stalling for time. We're running out the clock until all the witnesses have finally passed on. So that evening, Jay Leno on The Tonight Show would bring this up in his opening monologue. And he was, a typical Leno type of, how silly can they be? How stupid do they think we are? Wouldn't crash dummies being mistaken for being aliens from outer space? So later in the show, Brian Williams, who used to be the anchor of NBC News, the evening as far as anchor, is on promoting some book, and Jay brings this up again. And Brian Williams very stoically, Jay, what's it going to take for the American people to finally believe their government? How about the truth? And this certainly wasn't it. So in other words, you see there too, how the willing accomplices in the press have been running interference on Roswell for the last 72 years. They're also making sure that you don't ever hear the truth about this. And believe me, we deal with them constantly. And they go out of their way to make sure you don't hear the truth.
Now, Don's good friend, Philip Klass. Here we are. This is
Far left. No, that's you. I'm sorry.
This is 1994. I'm on the left, and Don is on the right. We're at what we thought was the crash site, what's his name? Frank Kaufman crash site. And it was, I think, the debut of your book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. So Philip Klass showed up. He's a classic debunker. Roswell never happened. He cherry picks the datum points. And here he is out at the base, out at the base of the cliff, where we thought the craft had crashed. And he just had a closed mind. There was nothing that would take place in the investigation that would turn him from his debunking quest. So, I guess that on the lower right, that's Kevin Randall's shoulder that you see there.
Do you have anything with Steve Schiff?
No.
No, okay. This was at the same time that Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico was also working with us. And after the crash dummy report would come out, well, let me digress for a second. After the first mobile report would come out, and I mentioned this yesterday morning, that I thought that would be the end of our working relationship with the congressman. I immediately called his office in Washington thinking that he would say, Don, they got the last word, or I believe their balloon explanation, nice to knowing you, goodbye. But instead, to my surprise, the congressman says, Don, and just to quote him, Don, they're a bunch of goddamn liars. I'm going to get reelected, and then we're going to hit them twice as hard. So then, 3 years later, when the crash dummy explanation came out in May of 1997, Schiff would put out a press release. And in it stated, he accused the Air Force of a massive ongoing cover-up. And he called a press conference. Here's a senior congressman in Washington accusing a branch of the military of a, quote, massive ongoing cover-up. Guess how many reporters showed up at the press conference? Zero. But guess who did show up? Philip J. Klass. He did show up.
Another one of Don's favorites is the late Peter Jennings. The snobbish, I always thought he was snobbish.
Worse than snobbish.
Worse than snobbish. He passed away in, I don't know, 06, somewhere 2006 or so, but before he passed away, He did this show in 2005 called Just UFOs. And he did a real good job, I thought, in the opening segment on the general subject of UFOs. When he got to Roswell, I was stunned. The Roswell segment, which now, you know, the Roswell is known all around the world. It's the granddaddy of all UFO reports, the one that has the most evidence for extraterrestrial visitation, we think. He says, Roswell, it's a myth. Next, well,
Nothing happened.
nothing happened. Well, we had his production company out there for a week almost.
4 days we filmed.
4 days, and you could see Don talking to the chief producer there, and I don't know about you, Don, but I think you have to say, I'm saying to myself, this guy's mind is already made up. He doesn't believe a thing.
Well, that they had their marching orders. In fact, we had Dr. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, MIT PhD, one of our biggest advocates on Roswell, wrote the foreword to our best-selling book, Witness to Roswell. They refused to even talk to him. They refused to speak to a single Roswell witness. They initially refused to go out to the debris field site with us until we finally insisted. And then we demanded, because they needed to go, as I would say, as we would both say, back to the scene of the crime. They're going to investigate the Alamo. You go to the Alamo, for example. And so the producer, the gentleman standing next to me in the white hat, would finally say to me afterwards, Don, you have to understand, we're doing exactly as we're instructed. How many know who Jeff Rentz is, or ever heard his radio show? Jeff used to work for ABC many years ago. Because we get a phone call, Stan Friedman and I get a phone call from ABC a week before the show was to premiere, to our primetime special. And the request from the producer was they wanted whatever B-roll we could provide, because they needed to quickly create a whole new Roswell segment. Well, it's like, well, what happened to the old one? We filmed for 4 days. Well, they wouldn't give us an answer. Well, I get a phone call from Jeff Rentz. He says, Don, I just got tipped off by somebody I worked with at ABC. He said that they sent out a review copy of the entire 2-hour program, except the Roswell segment went, as he put it, somewhere else. And they didn't like it. And they had to scrap it. So what you see in that program is all old footage, not from ABC, but CBS, NBC, BBC, and it has really nothing to do with what we had filmed for the actual production. So there again, journalism at its finest. Because when it comes to Roswell, again, they get their marching orders.
This myth conclusion, because we figure that's the one that's out now, because the dummies from the sky didn't work and Project Mogul fell apart like a cheap suit.
So myth is the fifth explanation.
Myth is the fifth explanation, but it's traceable to this book, UFO Crash at Roswell, The Genesis of a Modern Myth. They're by 2 cultural anthropologists from Rutgers University. And what they did is, they teach folklore. That is their main subject is folklore. How myths are generated over generations. And so they created a template for it. And how this happens. And all they did was plug in Roswell information into this template. And voila, it came out a myth. So that's where the Jennings idea came from. At least we're convinced it came from this book. So Frank Kaufman, the hardest witnesses for Don and I to scope out, to determine whether they're truthful or not, are the ones who were actually here at the base at the time, but were not involved in the recovery or the episode. but they plug themselves into the story because they know the landscape. They know everything that went on at the base. And oh, I knew Colonel Blanchard, blah, 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 blah. Well, this fellow here on the left is a fellow by the name of Frank Kaufman. He was a personnel clerk on the base at the time. He's receiving the World War II Victory Medal from the Deputy Base Commander, pain in the neck, Jennings. That was supposed to be a little humor right there. I could never go on stage.
I didn't laugh either, so.
His name Payne Jennings, and the airmen on the base used to call him Peter Payne. And
So there's another Peter Jennings.
and so he was on the base, and so Don and I, we were directed to him by Walter Howe, and here he is in later life telling another whopper, and but it was tough because he sounded, you know, like he knew what he was talking about, but the thing was he had the wrong crash site. He said that was a salted site, that it was not a real site. It was created by the Air Force to divert people like Don and myself. And here he is in the base hangar. He's pointing to, this is hangar P3 and building 84. It's still there today, but he's pointing to where all the wreckage was in the hangar. Now, he had no idea. I'm sure he was not allowed in the hangar, but this is part of his story. I think that's Don way in the background. I'm not sure, but it could be Don.
No, it is.
And that's right. I took the picture, so I'm not in it.
No, it's you taking the picture.
So Kaufman was from Brooklyn, and he retired to Roswell. And he was a great art. He was an art major, and one of the things he did was he drew what he said was the depiction of the aliens. He said they were the most beautiful people he ever saw. I'm looking at that. I said, "Really?" And but he drew that. And the other thing of note was, by this time we were suspecting something was amiss with Frank Kaufman. So after he passed away, we had access to his office by his wife. We had access to his office and found this special typewriter. An Underwood, I don't know, looks like about a 1930s model. He used to write these orders and things claiming to be from this officer or that officer, and we go, gee, gosh, look at that. Well, he typed them on this typewriter because it had that way of producing the letters that are a little different with a modern electric typewriter or computer. So he had another special typewriter, a little newer than that, but I just included this as part of his paraphernalia that was in his office. So Don can pick it up right there.
Well, we found old onion skin paper that was part of this because one of the things that Frank did throughout our entire association was present all these documents, so attempting to prove to us that he was one of what we called the nine, that they were the ones in charge of the actual recovery operation. And Kaufman, and Tom said that he was just a sergeant as far as in personnel, but he would claim at one point that he had a rank as a senior officer up to the rank of a full-board colonel. And
he never came across as a
no, he didn't sound like an officer, but nonetheless, I mean, he kept presenting documents. So we found all the means by which he forged and did cut and paste up, and even when we pulled out desk drawers and I'm reaching underneath and I'm looking for anything and I find this satchel and I pull it out and I place it down, I open it up, and it's all the original documents that we then could compare to the ones he was presenting us And each and every one had been doctored, had been cut and pasted up, because here we had his original. It still comes back to, as Tom said, he was a great artist. He was an excellent artist. And he'd only been in Roswell for all of a couple of years. And what's wrong with this picture? He comes home, his wife is all packed up, they're ready to go back to Brooklyn. And he goes, honey, unpack. We're staying in Roswell. I just got a job with the Chamber of Commerce after having been here all of 2 years. So then we track down the original minutes where he's introduced to the other members of the chamber, which reads, unlike all other members of the chamber, Mr. Kaufman will be paid by an outside source. So we also have confirmed that he was visited at his home a week before he died by an Air Force captain who just walked into the house unannounced in front of his wife and his grandson. Happened to know exactly where the bedroom was walking down the hallway, and had spent a half hour with Frank. Walked out, sat in Frank's recliner in the family room for a few minutes, just sitting there. Got up and then let himself out. The family observed that there was a limo waiting for him. So that he is part of our gray basket. He's somebody now that we're going to find out who he was working for. And so as a result, we refer to Frank Kaufman as the storekeeper. That he got in trouble somehow, that he was involved somehow, and that he was kept behind to latch on to researchers, investigators such as us, to make sure that he couldn't stop us, but he could divert us, distract us, send us off on wild goose chases, and that he certainly did. So he was a master at that.
Okay. Do you know who that is? You know who that? You know who that is?
It moved forward. It's John Smith.
I lost my place here. Wait a minute. Wow.
Oh, that's him.
That's it, yeah.
John Trowbridge. That's Don in the middle saying, what is this guy talking about? And there's Larry Landsman, the producer of one of our documentaries from the Sci-Fi Channel. He's on the left. You can see he doesn't believe this guy at all.
Yeah.
It's John Trowbridge, who worked in Jesse Marcel's shop, I believe.
It was in intelligence. Yeah.
In intelligence back in '47. And he comes in, this is only a few years ago, to the museum here.
His son brought him in.
Huh?
His son brought him in.
His son brought him in. His son is the fellow in the background with the I hope they believe this, Dad, smile on his face. And his story was that he was with, over at the Marcel house the night Jesse came back with the wreckage. There's no evidence, and no one ever claimed from the Marcel family that anybody was there that night. This fellow, we believe, on the instigation of his son, plugged himself into the story. And it was actually his was easy to debunk because it was so obviously a lie that
was mainly put up by his son.
it was put up by his son. I think his son at some point called the museum and said, well, "I'll give you my father's story for $100,000." I don't think they grabbed that.
We offer 50. No, okay.
Here's another one of our favorites. This is Fred Lathe. About 10 years ago, we started getting emails from his son, Frank Lathe, that his father, who was at Roswell in 1947 in the first Air Transport Unit, was also a noted photographer. Ooh, I wonder if he took pictures that we're interested in. Yes, he took pictures. You'd want to see them, but even more than that, I found that after he passed away, he drowned in 1964. I found these palm-sized pieces of strange metal I said, when I was talking to him in front, I said, I'm on the next plane. Oh, no, don't come. I'm going to take a trip to the West Coast. I'll call you when I get back. Right. Well, he never called. I finally called him and he says, oh, I don't have that anymore. I sent it to a friend in Washington State for safekeeping. Oh, right. So we stopped communicating. In fact, I think we had an investigator go visit Frank Lane at his shop.
Yeah, right.
It was a hole-in-the-wall
In Texas.
repair shop in San Antonio, I believe. And he said, I don't think you want to believe this guy. He's just,
San Antonio.
yeah.
Sorry.
What was a hole-in-the-wall? I mean, we've all seen those repair shops. They're everywhere. Even in your town. No, that can't be true. That can't be true. So that was it. We bailed on this guy. Well, don't you know? A few years later, this Frank Lay's grandson tries the same thing on us again. I said, how many? Fool me once. Shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Same story. Says, oh, I really mean it this time. I'm the fellow's grandson. And we just never, that's it, we never did bite on it again. But that's Fred Lathe and his children and grandchildren trying to present a false flag on because he was there, but he didn't have any information. The Plains of St. Augustine was a false flag. It started out, maybe we can go a few minutes later. The Plains of St. Augustine near Socorro, when I started, there was a story of a crash there that they plugged in the first Roswell book. They plugged the Plains of St. Augustine. That there was this soil conservation engineer who discovered a crashed flying disc and with bodies. It was near the very large array, so you knew it had to be true because they were interested in the very large array. It all turned out to be bogus because the story the gentleman was telling took place later in 1950 rather than 1947, so it had nothing to do, whether it was true or not, with the Roswell case. A witness later appeared named Gerald Anderson, who tried to reignite the same story, and unfortunately Stan Friedman was an advocate for this fellow. This guy was a liar from the start. And he had family down near Magdalena, New Mexico. He claimed that this was the crash site on the Far Ranch near Magdalena. And again, that story was bogus. And I brought my wife to one of our trips to the crash site, and she was trying to lead us astray as well.
She fooled you all these years.
She fooled me all these years. She brought some bubble gum wrappers, some of that silver stuff in your bubble gum wrapper. So I had to include that.
Can I just quickly mention as far as the Plains of St. Augustine? From all historic documentation, there was a plane crash out on the plains in 1945. Wreckage and bodies were scattered for miles. Area was cordoned off by the military, so it was the beginning of almost that urban legend, so to speak, and then tying it in with what happened in Roswell 47. There was a radar facility also within the plains area. Whenever they would have a launch from White Sands to the south, they obviously did their tracking at that particular installation. And whenever they did have a scheduled launch, they would evacuate all the ranchers throughout the area and put them up in a motel in Socorro for the time being without giving them any explanation. So it all would lend itself. The military coming in and out and all the very secret and sinister activity. So it all played into what became the urban legend of the plain St. Augustine being connected to Roswell. There is no connection, period.
There was a fellow named Dan Richards who unfortunately died early in an automobile accident who had allegedly a cave where he stored some of the wreckage back in 1947. And we always looked for it, and we found it in the year 2003 or 4, something like that. And there you see Don kneeling on this cave. It had collapsed. So I was telling Don, go in, go in, go in.
Check it out. I was getting ready.
But there it is,
60 feet drop.
60-foot drop. I said, jump, jump. So we never did go in Richard's Cave. Here's one that we got this story from a woman who had visited one of the alien type cafes here in Roswell, and she said that this old cowboy came up to her and said, I know where the bodies are buried. I know. And whenever we hear about the bodies, it's whoa, it goes right to the top of the list. Where are they buried? Well, they're buried at the old state fairgrounds here in Roswell.
County Fair.
And so we went to the state fairgrounds. Why would they bury bodies there? You know, I have no. But it was along this wall. It was along this wall. Well, it turned out to be, there they are. There's the two. It's a junction cable. There's a cable underneath, and that was it. And this woman felt terrible about, because I went out with Kevin Randall that day. He did the digging. And,
You supervised, yeah.
yes. And this is a long story. I won't do this one, but this is the plumber, John Price. Is a long. Don and I traveled 3,000, by our.
It was the one time that we seriously considered breaking into a house. We did, because with the thought that there was pieces of memory material hidden behind a retainer wall down in the basement.
A few years ago, the museum offered $1 million for a verified piece of wreckage. One of the first things that came in was this piece of Japanese jewelry, which I don't know how long we were stupefied by that, but it turned out to be a piece of Japanese jewelry. This other thing came in, I don't know what that was.
What is the same as far as just the spectral analysis?
Yes. Another one came in. This to me looks like the bottom of a seat, that you sit on. But this guy said, "Oh, this is from San Antonio, Mexico."
Ray Baca.
Ray Baca, yes. Here's one. This is actually a Malaysian soup spoon. And I don't know what this is. It looks like some. It looks like.
That's the claim to St. Augustine. That's Art Campbell. No, that's what.
Yeah, it's either some sort of
Artificial heart.
Or a turkey that's ready for cooking on Thanksgiving. I don't know. And a few years ago, they started with these.
This I have to. They are still claiming, they are still promoting this particular one as a genuine artifact from a bogus crash site. And these are people that you will see on television on a regular basis. In fact, one of them has a regular show on the Travel Channel. That's the reason that he continues
Much to our chagrin.
I know. Promote the fact that as soon as we saw that, and a reporter from the Roswell Daily Record came here to the office, we looked at it and asked Providence, and we said, "You realize we've been selling these at the gift shop here for years." As it turns out, the gentleman who claimed to find that particular stone, it was his daughter that was producing them for us. Again, another example. The truth doesn't matter. The facts don't matter. And as far as television, it's like, hey, a piece of a genuine artifact as far as the crash UFO. Let's go with it. Doesn't matter that it's as phony as.
This was sent to us a few years ago by a lab analyst at the Lawrence Livermore Labs in California. He said they were given this project to work on this strange memory type metal, and he saved a piece. And he sent me this photograph. I can't vouch for it. I just show it to you. He claims this is a piece of the actual wreckage that he had saved. So it's not very big, but there it is. And I forget his name, but I told him I'd never go public with it. But this is another photograph sent to us by a MUFON person out in California, claiming that this is the wreckage on the ranch. You can see these white spots on the bottom of this field, and they were allegedly taken by a photographer from 1947, but he turned out to be from in the 1950s, so it suggests that he was handed to him by somebody. Here's a close-up of one of the pieces. I don't vouch for that. I don't know what that is. I just show it to you. Why someone would take a picture of that, I don't know. The last picture on their little thing that they gave us, they said, well, the craft was stored, it was kept in front of somebody's house in Roswell. I said, oh my God, yeah, why would a spaceship is in front of Uncle Joe's house? Well, if you look at it, what it is, it's a large searchlight. It's a large searchlight that they have, like, for trying to advertise something special, but it was presented to us as the spaceship. And this, last but not least, is the one that I blew. It was presented to us as one of the cadavers that was recovered from Roswell. And if you notice, there's a placard at the foot that you can't read. Well, this was one of two photos that was sent to me. The other one was the same photo, but you could see the writing there. And for 3 years we tried, Don knows this, we tried to decipher that writing. Nobody could. Nobody could. So we give the presentation in Mexico City. The very next day we received this. Somebody had translated it. This mummy of a 2-year-old child was found in something on the ledge in front of the second story of Montezuma's castle. And first I said, this can't be, because we worked 3 years on that, and here's somebody coming with a translation. Well, we then researched some of the mummies, and there you see, here the original mummy is up at the top, and you can see with the placard it says that, it was a mummy of a 2-year-old child. The middle one is how they found it, and the one on the bottom is how it was presented to us by someone who we will not name as the Roswell, one of the Roswell cadavers. So that's the
who was the owner was a graphic artist, graphic illustrator. And whether it was Dr. David Rudiak, Dr. Donald Burleson, Ray Dowling of Studio Macbeth in New York, the pathologist, the anthropologist, the forensic experts, everyone was telling us it was genuine. That this was not a human cadaver. Down to the number of ribs, down to the fact there were no rotator cuffs. The carpal bones within the hands and the feet were totally wrong. They were not human. And the placard itself that we were provided, now mind you, we were never provided the actual slides. We relied on...
All we did was
we could hold them up, yeah, but then we only could hold them for a second.
Yeah.
And they also insisted we sign as far as statements of confidentiality, that we could not talk or share anything with anyone until they were released to the public. The placard, they stretched the letters so it appeared to be script. They've altered the body, they altered the shadowing, and they only provided us with tight shots of the body itself and did not allow us to see the museum displays in the background.
There was a missing photo between the two.
Right.
And that was the one that was showed it was a museum shot.
Museum shot. Right.
And somehow that got out to somebody, I don't know how, and they were able to use the placard to translate it, because we had experts on that placard. They couldn't decipher one letter. And I would try for 3 years, and every now and again, I couldn't get one letter on that. So, but anyway, we thank you all for coming today. We just give you some of the things that we encounter in the last 25 years on our search for the Holy Grail, which is a piece of memory metal. We're looking for a piece of memory metal.
So we have the panel coming up at the top of the hour, so if you come back, sorry you don't have a full hour for dinner, but then we don't have any time for dinner. So somebody bring us a sandwich if you could, so thank you. So see you a little bit.
Yeah, good work.